Thank you, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. After such a mini-symposium on high-tech endoscopic techniques, and then this beautiful imagery-related brochures and pricing, it's a little bit of a cold shower, maybe, that I have taken on the challenge to tell you a little bit about less is more in endoscopy. Now let me start out by saying that I really love what I'm doing. I love the technical challenges of interventional endoscopy. I enjoy working with the newest of the newest in the field, and I'm privileged that in Amsterdam we generally have access to the latest technology and are able to work on new technology. And in all fairness, I always feel extremely privileged to be invited for high-quality meetings like this. And in all honesty, most of my professional ego, and according to some, most of my ego in total, is based on what I can do as an endoscopist or on my work as an endoscopic researcher. Yet I do think it's time that we reflect on our endoscopic work. Because what we've seen is a remarkable increase in the volume of endoscopy over the last 30 years. And yet, although we are all convinced that we're doing good to our patients, just a modest amount of our daily life is actually driven by level 1 evidence. And much of what we do is actually based on weak evidence, or even worse, expert opinion. And a significant part of our endoscopies is actually of dubious value to our patients. So what I want to show you in the next 15 minutes is I want to convince you that overuse of endoscopy is basically looming in every endoscopy list that you have. And I want to make you more aware of what are the driving forces behind you and behind patients driving this overutilization. And I think it's time that at least we plant seeds in the brains of all endoscopists thinking about a less is more attitude in endoscopy, because we cannot continue with healthcare as we're doing, as we have been doing over the last 10 years. If we speak about what is then the proof that we're actually overutilizing endoscopy, colonoscopy surveillance is actually a good example. Studies estimate that 1 out of 4 colonoscopies, surveillance colonoscopies in the United States, actually represent overuse. So 50% of Medicare users that have had a negative screening colonoscopy will get a second screening colonoscopy or surveillance colonoscopy within 7 years. And even if you remove a couple of very small polyps, for which guidelines say that you should at least wait 5 or 10 years or even not survey the patient at all, 1/3 of these patients will get a second colonoscopy within 4 years. Crazy Americans? Well, also in Europe, 29% in Italy. Only colonoscopy? Nope. Meta-analysis of over 13,000 upper GI endoscopies show that 22% of those endoscopies are simply inappropriate according to guidelines. So it's fair to say that inappropriate exams are common across multiple clinical scenarios, practice settings, and geographic locations. Then what is driving this? The main driver: we and our patients fear of dying of cancer. And that means that cancer is perceived not only by our patients, but also by us, as a disease that if you don't do anything about it, it will have a fatal outcome. So not treating a cancer, the patient will die. And this same connotation is attached to terminology like dysplasia or polyps, or if we speak about cancer precursors like intraepithelial neoplasia, it scares patients almost just as much as the word cancer. And everybody here in the audience knows somebody who at least thinks, or everybody thinks, that he or she was cured by having an early cancer found. This is the popularity paradox of screening. Whereas this may actually be totally nonsense. So let's look at prostate cancer. It's the most common male cancer. Yet if you would investigate any male above the age of 80, large-scale studies and abduction studies have shown that 60% of all males will have prostate cancer if you would take out their prostate above the age of 80. And it's 40% above the age of 70 or something like that. Yet the lifetime risk of actually dying of prostate cancer is only 2%. And we've now have multiple studies and large clinical trials that show that there is actually no difference in the dying rate of prostate cancer if you screen with PSA or with rectal exams, or you just don't screen at all. And the most recent guidelines in urology have now adapted a watchful waiting in most asymptomatic male patients with prostate cancer. So they have a cancer, you don't do anything about it, and they don't die. This is a change of attitude and a change of perception, yet over the course of the last 10 years, a lot of hospitals have bought robotic surgery justifying that they needed that for their prostate resections. And we have had thousands and thousands of male patients being operated with significant side effects like impotence and incontinence for a cancer that we are now watchful waiting, because the patient will very unlikely die from that cancer. So the take-home is that cancer, dysplasia, cysts, polyp, whatever, they are not a prediction with an inevitably fatal outcome. They are merely a time point estimate of what's happening now, and they are not necessarily pathological, yet probably more morphological. So it's the challenge how to deal with that. And here is where we go wrong, because we just can't stand uncertainty in our profession. So many of the conditions we do endoscopies for will never progress to cause any symptoms, leave alone death. And the issue is then, are we dealing with a relevant disease? And that's a tough decision to make. I admit, it's driven by what actually have I found? Was it high-grade dysplasia on a Barrett's or hyperplastic polyp in the rectum? What's its progression rate? And what are the competing risks for the patient to die of something else? And now the conundrum is that we don't know how these factors will interact, neither at a population basis nor individually. And here's where we go wrong. We just can't stand uncertainty. So this is what we do. Treat it and be done with it, instead of facing an uncertain future outcome. And actually, we are creating more and more and more of these issues because we do better. The quality of our endoscopies have dramatically improved. We have high definition and optical chromoscopy. We have image guide and variable stiffness, so we get to the cecum more frequently. We have water jets now incorporated in our endoscopes, and we have better bowel prep so that we can see more. And then we are better trained, and we are followed up with our ADR so we can actually recognize more. Well, logically, this should improve the detection of lesions because we're missing out on less, but inevitably, we also are increasing the number of patients with irrelevant disease. So the overperformance, for instance, in colonoscopy is very likely there. The randomized trials on which we are basing our colonoscopy screening programs date back more than 10 or 15 years ago. The kind of polyps they found at that time with the endoscopies at that time were very likely bigger, uglier, and more relevant than the ones we are picking up now. So the surveillance intervals that we are using, I'm not arguing against screening, but what happens after that? The surveillance intervals after a state-of-the-art polyp cleaning colonoscopy are likely to be associated with overuse. And the ADR is something that is partially driving this. The adenoma detection rate. We know it's good because it finds the underperformers and lifts them to a level that is appropriate. The downside is that we are finding more adenomas inevitably increases the disease reservoir, and if we are optimizing people that are already adequately performing, inevitably there's overperformance. There is a certain performance level above which finding more adenomas doesn't help the patient, only causes shorter and unnecessary surveillance colonoscopies, increases costs, and have the patient worry more. And then the problem is, if we try to balance this, we are punished as well. Doing sells, talking sucks. Because it's much easier to convince a patient for undergoing a submucosal tunneling and endoscopic resection of a submucosal tumor of 15 millimeters with its associated risks, and it's also more fun and challenging for the endoscopist to do so, then instead of doing that, having to sit down with that patient probably 2 or 3 times, trying to explain him the whole balance sheet of a wait-and-see policy and facing the uncertain outcome in the future. So actually we make money with unnecessary procedures, but we are hardly reimbursed for talking to our patients. So bad news, if we're going to do less is more in endoscopy, you will have to spend more time on your patients, and you're going to make less money. And if you think that's inappropriate, then we should battle that. Logically, unnecessary endoscopies, apart from being pretty useless to our patients and creating costs and contributing to the carcinophobia of our society, it's all relevant. But the most important thing that most of us don't realize is that it causes harm to our patients. Not the obvious harm. Not the harm that you all know about, because they are directly associated to the procedure. So you know about your perforations after diagnostic colonoscopy, and you know about the small risk of a post-FNA pancreatitis. But we are much less aware of the bigger, very bigger part of the iceberg. And that's the subtle, hidden, uncertain associated damage that we do to our patients. For instance, a cardiovascular accident after stopping anticoagulant therapy. Or your patient that in his bowel preparation for his colonoscopy walks to the toilet at night, falls and breaks his hip. Anything that we do will cause psychological stress on our patients, and if the patient already suffers from somatic fixation, you are actually contributing to that. You think I'm crazy? Far-fetched? Or all this stuff is too small to be relevant? Or dubious causal relationship? Or difficult to measure? Time to wake up. We underestimate the harmful effects of unnecessary endoscopies. So here's the inconvenient truth. We and our patients, we drive endoscopic overconsumption. Why? Well, because we overestimate the risk and the severity of many of these precursor lesions. And if we don't do it, the patient does it. And then we overestimate how good we are in doing endoscopies, how protective that is, and how positive effect that has on the outcomes. Think about the prostate cancer that we cure at the age of 80, whereas the patient would never have died from it. And more importantly, this is something that is much more hidden and we are much less aware of. We underestimate the negative effect of our unnecessary endoscopies. So we're focusing on the few cases that we think are being saved because we find that prostate cancer at the age of 80, because we diagnose it early. And these cases are clearly visible. Yet the collateral damage that we do is hidden and covers everybody on which we do these endoscopies. So then how do we change this? This is going to be tough because a lot of this is almost in our system and in our society. Nevertheless, we should not just go with the flow here. One of the things we should do is that we should raise thresholds of disease instead of lowering calling something a disease. Some of the work I've been involved with means that you don't biopsy very short segments of Barrett's anymore. Less than 1 centimeter, just don't biopsy. Raise the threshold of screening. And then only survey these patients if they have intestinal metaplasia and a life expectancy more than 5 years. So raise the threshold of surveillance in these cases. And then don't treat everybody with low grade. Insist on having it confirmed and at multiple occasions. Again, raising a threshold, in this case, for intervening. Most of these thresholds of what we decide is disease or normal find their origin in decisions made by guideline committees. And they are usually based on expert opinion only. And throughout medicine, there is a tendency to lower these thresholds over time. Here's a very interesting study in this respect, published in PLOS, and it looked at the US guidelines between 2003 and 2013, and they picked the 25 most relevant diseases in their society, like depression, hypertension, and diabetes. 14 of these guidelines, in 10 of them, the disease was made bigger by widening the definition of the disease. Here is a dramatic example of that. This is the 2018 American College of Cardiology and American Heart Association advice on high blood pressure in the United States. And they advised, again, lowering what we would call hypertension from 140/90 to 130/80. On the day after the guideline, 31 million healthy Americans now were suffering of hypertension. 46% of the whole American population then has hypertension. So we're labeling patients, or people actually, as patients. And this was heavily battled, not by the specialists and the cardiologists, no, by those doctors who are a little bit closer to the patient. The family caregivers. They stood up and they said, "Are you out of your mind? Are you crazy? Where is the proof for this?" And they have battled this ever since. And this is what we should be doing. But are we that different from the cardiologists? Could it be that our general practitioners might say, "Are you crazy surveying all these patients for these teeny-weeny little polyps that you're doing? Or taking out these submucosal tumors?" We are just as fixed on our specialization as the cardiologists are. So I think we should adopt a less is more strategy then for our guideline committees. I think we should send out every guideline committee with, "I don't care what you do, but when you come out of this room, you show me a guideline that reduces the endoscopic burden of your disease with 25%. Or 50 or 20 or I don't care. Make it less." So, for instance, this is what we did with the ESGE Barrett's guideline. We incorporated a minimal life expectancy and we said we will stop at the age of 75. We reduced the level of screening, the level of surveillance, and it will drop the number of Barrett's endoscopies with 40%. if we do this. Every guideline committee will go crazy if you tell them. And say, well, okay, if you want to make it bigger, if you want to drop this blood pressure thing, or if you want to widen the indication for whatever you want to do, then show me proof. You just can't say, because you are the experts, that you think this is better for our patients anymore. We're not going to accept that. If you want to expand the burden of the disease, we need proof. And that means that we should have all these guideline committees at least be chaired by somebody who has more connection to proof than to the disease. Now, if we're going to hit on the guideline committees, they will find those areas of uncertainty where they don't know if their expert opinion and proof, they want to bring that together. So this is then where we move from a less is more strategy for guidelines committees to a less is more to guide evidence-based endoscopy. So we need more controlled trials on less is more strategies. Most of the endoscopic research is driven by new technology. I would argue that we also need at least a certain amount of our energy and our money needs to be focused on those studies that are looking at, are we really doing any good to our patients for this widening of indications or surveillance? And the guidelines committees are the ideal group of people then to come up with this. And if we send them in that room to come back with something that's 25% less, then the national societies who actually are ordering those guideline committees, they should back up those lowering guidelines, and they should then support these studies. We should go to healthcare providers and to the government saying, look, here's 5 guidelines from our society. Each of them drops the amount of endoscopies that we're doing with 25%. This will save the government money, this will save the healthcare providers money, and we need a small part of that money to run these studies. You still save more money than the trial will cost you, but we're moving from widening disease based on key opinion leaders to just focused evidence-based, less is more endoscopy. And then finally, what can you do? Please stick to the guidelines. Don't widen them on yourself. Patting the patient on the shoulder saying, the guideline says that I should see you back in 3 years, but I think I should just see you back next year. If you do that to a patient, the patient will think, boy, this doctor really takes good care of me. Whereas he should be kicking you in the ass. So this is what we can do. Stick to the guidelines, because that's our entry. And then, if you don't do that, we're going to hunt you down. And that should probably start by not paying you if you do inappropriate endoscopies. Now, I'm not so keen on having a zillion quality parameters attached to endoscopy. As head of endoscopy in Amsterdam, I already suffer by how I can make all these quality parameters available. Yet I do think it would be a good quality indicator also to look at how often do you do stuff outside the guidelines? Do you find your indications on your own? And more importantly, I think you should just trust your patients a little bit more by telling them, I don't know, I'm not really sure if you should have that endoscopy. If you would be my father, I would probably advise you not to have the endoscopy or something like that. And I think I would like societies to insist that we should also at least document that we actually are doing that we have considered not doing the endoscopy in the patient, and that we have discussed this with the patient. And I know doing is good and talking sucks, but that's simply the way we need to go if we want to keep healthcare under control. And then finally, I think we need to be much more aware of what drives overutilization and overdiagnosis and the negative effects. It's something that I only learned on the way while I was already practicing endoscopy. It slowly fell into my mind, and ever since then I'm trying to speak to colleagues and at least share that with them. It should be in the basic teaching of our fellows and of us as endoscopists. I don't think I will comment just to this, but a lot of what we do is actually fun. I don't think this guy put on the flippers and the goggles just to be a better soccer player, but because he thought it would be more challenging to be a good soccer player. I challenge you, questioning how often do you do endoscopies that are a little bit like this? Please consider this for the rest of your practice, and I'm happy to debate that with you after this meeting. Thank you very much.